8 U.S. vice presidents have become president after their predecessor died or resigned. But did you know that before 1967, there was no clear rule for replacing a vacant vice presidency? For decades, the country simply went without a vice president if one left office. So what exactly does the Constitution say about vice presidential succession? And how does it work today? The United States has a clear process for what happens if a president can no longer serve. But this process wasn't always well defined. The Constitution originally laid out some basic rules, but it left a lot of questions unanswered. Over time, amendments were added to clarify the process and ensure a smooth transition of power. When the framers wrote the Constitution, they knew they had to include a plan for what would happen if the president couldn't continue in office. This led to Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6, which states that if the president is removed, dies, resigns, or becomes unable to perform the job, the vice president takes over the powers and duties of the office. Now, this wording might seem clear, but in reality, it was pretty vague. The clause didn't say whether the vice president actually becomes president or if they're just temporarily acting as president. This may not seem like a big deal, but back in the early days of the Republic, it caused some real confusion. The first real test of this clause came in 1841 when President William Henry Harrison died just 32 days into his presidency, the shortest term in U.S. history. His vice president, John Tyler, took the oath of office and declared himself the new president. But some people weren't so sure that was allowed. They thought Tyler should just act as president, not become the president. Tyler, however, insisted he had full presidential powers, and Congress eventually agreed. This set a precedent that the vice president fully assumes the presidency if the office becomes vacant. Even though Tyler's case settled things in practice, the Constitution itself remained unclear. It wouldn't be until over a century later that this issue was officially settled through an amendment. Another major constitutional change came with the 20th Amendment, which was ratified in 1933. The main goal of this amendment was to shorten the lame duck period between a president's election and their inauguration. But it also addressed an important issue in succession. Before this amendment, there was no clear rule for what would happen if a president-elect, someone who had been elected but not yet sworn in, died before taking office. Imagine that. A new president gets elected in November, but before January 20th, they pass away. What happens next? The 20th Amendment made it clear, if a president-elect dies before taking office, the vice president-elect becomes president. This might seem like common sense today, but before this amendment, the rules were unclear, and people weren't sure whether Congress would have to pick a new president or if the previous president's term would be extended. Thankfully, the 20th Amendment cleared things up. The most important and detailed rules for presidential succession came with the 25th Amendment, which was ratified in 1967. By this time, it was clear that the old system wasn't enough. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and the long-standing health problems of previous presidents showed just how critical it was to have a clear and detailed plan in place. The 25th Amendment tackled several major issues. First, Section 1 made it absolutely clear that if the president dies, resigns, or is removed from office, the vice president doesn't just assume the duties of the job, they become the president. This put to rest the old debate that had started back in 1841 with John Tyler. Section 2 dealt with another big problem. What happens if the vice presidency becomes vacant? Before this amendment, if a vice president left office for any reason, there was no official way to replace them. This meant that at various points in history, the U.S. operated without a vice president for years at a time. The 25th Amendment changed that by allowing the president to nominate a new vice president, who must then be confirmed by both houses of Congress. Sections 3 and 4 of the amendment address the issue of presidential disability. What happens if the president is alive but unable to perform their duties? Section 3 allows the president to voluntarily step aside, temporarily transferring power to the vice president, and then reclaiming it when they recover. This has been used a few times when presidents have undergone medical procedures under anesthesia. Section 4 is more serious. It allows the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare that the president is unable to perform their duties, making the vice president the acting president. If the president disputes this, Congress makes the final decision, requiring a 2/3 majority in both chambers to remove the president from power permanently. This section has never been used but has been discussed in times of political and health crises. One of the biggest problems in U.S. history was that for much of it, there was no process to fill a vacant vice presidency. Before the 25th Amendment, if a vice president died or resigned, the country just had to do without one until the next election. This created long gaps where there was no second in command. For example, after President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, took over. But there was no vice president for the rest of his term. The same thing happened when Vice President Garrett Hobart died in 1899. President William McKinley had no vice president for nearly 2 years until the next election. Section 2 of the 25th Amendment fixed this issue by allowing the president to nominate a new vice president if the office becomes vacant. The nominee then must be confirmed by a majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. This part of the amendment has been used twice in U.S. history. The first time was in 1973, when Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned due to corruption charges. President Richard Nixon nominated Gerald Ford as his replacement, and Ford was confirmed by Congress. Then in 1974, President Nixon himself resigned, making Ford the new president. Ford then used the same process to nominate Nelson Rockefeller as vice president. So in just 2 years, the U.S. had gone from Nixon and Agnew to Ford and Rockefeller, all through the process outlined in the 25th Amendment. This amendment has ensured that there is always a clear and legal process for filling a vice presidential vacancy, preventing any future long gaps in leadership. The simplest way for a president to temporarily step aside is voluntary transfer of power, which is covered under Section 3 of the 25th Amendment. This allows the president to declare themselves unable to perform their job and temporarily hand over their responsibilities to the vice president. In this situation, the vice president becomes the acting president, not a full replacement, just a temporary stand-in. The key word here is voluntary. The president has to make the decision themselves and submit a written declaration to Congress, stating that they are unable to discharge their duties. Once they recover and feel ready to take back their role, they send another declaration saying they are ready to return. This has happened a few times in U.S. history, mostly for medical reasons. The most notable examples are when President Ronald Reagan and President George W. Bush underwent medical procedures that required anesthesia. In both cases, they transferred power to their vice presidents for a few hours while they were unconscious. Once they recovered, they sent a formal notice saying they were ready to return to duty. Voluntary transfer of power is pretty straightforward. But what if a president can't or won't admit they are unable to do their job? That's where things get complicated. Things get tricky when the president doesn't voluntarily give up power, but is clearly unable to perform their duties. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment outlines a process for dealing with this exact situation. Here's how it works. If the vice president and a majority of the top government officials, like the president's cabinet, believe that the president isn't capable of running the country, they can send a written declaration to Congress stating that the president is unable to perform their job. Once that happens, the vice president immediately takes over as acting president. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The president can fight back. If they disagree with the decision, they can send their own letter to Congress saying that they are fine and ready to return to office. If that happens, the vice president and the cabinet have 4 days to respond. If they still think the president is unfit, the decision gets sent to Congress, which then has 21 days to decide. For the president to be removed from power, 2/3 of both the House and the Senate must vote in favor of keeping the vice president as acting president. If Congress doesn't reach that threshold, the president gets their job back. This section of the amendment has never been officially used, but it has been discussed during times of crisis. For example, after President Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981, there were discussions about invoking Section 4, but it wasn't necessary because Reagan quickly recovered. More recently, some political figures called for using Section 4 against President Donald Trump following the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021, arguing that he was unfit to lead. However, it was never formally invoked. The involuntary transfer of power is one of the most dramatic and controversial parts of the 25th Amendment. It's meant to be a last resort, used only in extreme cases where the president is truly unable to govern. What if something happened to President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris had to take over? Whether it's due to death, resignation, or incapacity, the 25th Amendment makes it clear what would happen next. If President Biden were to leave office, whether by resignation, removal, or death, Vice President Kamala Harris would immediately become President of the United States. There would be no debate, no delay, no vote. Under Section 1 of the 25th Amendment, the Vice President automatically takes over the presidency. She wouldn't just be acting as president, she would become the full-fledged President of the United States, with all the powers and responsibilities that come with the job. This is different from earlier years in U.S. history, when there was confusion over whether the Vice President should just step in temporarily or fully take over. Thanks to the 25th Amendment, there's no uncertainty anymore. Once Kamala Harris becomes president, she faces an important decision: choosing a new vice president. The vice presidency would be vacant, and the U.S. government can't afford to operate without a second-in-command. Under Section 2 of the 25th Amendment, Harris would nominate someone to be the new vice president. But she can't just pick anyone and put them in office. Her nominee would have to be confirmed by both the House of Representatives and the Senate before officially becoming vice president. Historically, this process has happened twice. In 1973, when Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned, President Richard Nixon nominated Gerald Ford to replace him. Then in 1974, when Nixon himself resigned, Ford became president and nominated Nelson Rockefeller as vice president. Both nominees were confirmed by Congress, ensuring that the vice presidency was never left empty for long. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.